Welcome to the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast.
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 Welcome to the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast with me, Dr. Janine Anderson. Heads up, this show may contain adult language and may mention specific foods. If you find either of those to be too triggering, I trust you to take care of yourself and do what you need to do. Today's guest is Dr. Anita Johnston. Dr. Johnston is the author of Eating in the Light of the Moon, is a licensed psychologist, certified eating disorder specialist, speaker, and consultant. With over 30 years of clinical experience, she is a leader in the field of eating disorder treatment. She is the director and founder of IPONO Eating Disorder Program and IPONO Residential Program in Maui. She is the co-creator of Light of the Moon Cafe, an interactive e-course and online support circle for women with eating disorders. You can find Dr. Johnston at www.dranitajohnston or her at Light of the Moon Cafe at www.lightofthemooncafe.com. One quick special announcement. Dr. Johnston's e-course, Light of the Moon Cafe, runs in different sessions, and so there's kind of a start date incorporated. And we just wanted to let you know that this episode should be released on February 25th or 26th, and you will still be able to join the upcoming session of the e-course. Everybody who signs up goes through the course together and then has lifetime access to the support circle online and to Dr. Johnston and her co-creator, Elizabeth, who's a dietitian, after they join the course. So we wanted to let you know, if you are listening in the future, if you sign up for Light of the Moon Cafe on February 25th, 26th, or 27th, they will be taking a few late entries. So just in case you hear this episode just in time, there's still time to sign up for her wonderful e-course and the online support circle that comes with it. I would highly recommend it. The information that comes along with it is wonderful. And then you also have access to Dr. Johnston, who is great. And all of the women in the support circle are really lovely people. It seems like a wonderful, wonderful resource. So just wanted to let you know about that. Dr. Johnston, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. I'm happy to be here.
So today we decided to talk about the two essential skills for eating disorder recovery, which were, I don't know if you want to name them or you want me to name them.
You name them.
Okay.
It's a test.
Emotional literacy and assertive communication. So I'm pretty excited to talk about both of these things. So is there one that you want to start with?
Well, I think I'll start with the emotional literacy because that really leads into the second, the assertive communication. And I think part of the problem, it's twofold. One, we live in a culture that is not very emotionally literate. We're not really taught a lot of language around our feelings. You know, we feel good or we feel bad. And it's kind of like, some cultures have lots of words for snow or ocean waves because they're around them a lot. And we should have lots of words at our fingertips for emotions, but we're really not taught. We're not taught the nature of our emotions. And in my experience, those who struggle with disordered eating of some sort are typically very emotionally sensitive, but for whatever reason, they don't have the language to express those feelings, and that's where the eating behaviors come in. So what happens is a lot of emotions get expressed through the behaviors. And so that's why the emotional literacy, where you have the capacity to identify, accept, and express your feelings, especially in words, if you can do that, you're putting the eating disorder out of a job.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what you're saying, especially because I don't think not only is our culture not incredibly emotionally literate, we never get classes or training or anything on how to identify emotions, or I would assume very few people do. But also, it seems to me that all of the, I guess you'd say, negatively valenced emotions We just want to get rid of those right away. Are you feeling bad? We'd better fix that stuff right now. Don't worry about it. Let's silver line it, wrap it up in a bow, get a game plan going.
Yeah, and I think it's because, again, we're not taught the nature of emotions. Number one, we're not taught that emotions are not moral. In fact, they're amoral. There's no good feelings or bad feelings. There's no right feelings or wrong feelings. Now, there's good and bad behavior, but the emotions behind them. So there's nothing wrong with feeling so angry you want to smash someone's face in. There is absolutely something wrong with doing it.
Right.
And so some of the confusion comes in when we start confusing behavior and emotions and think that there's good or bad, right or wrong feelings. And so, as you said, then we think we got to get rid of those bad ones. And the bad ones are usually the ones that are the most uncomfortable. And the other part about it is we're not taught that emotions they're different from thoughts and different from attitudes in the sense that their nature is their waves, their emotions, their energy in motion. And once they start to come in, they have a path that's their own, and that path is they come in, they peak, and they pass. And then they might come in again and peak and pass. And so their nature is not to stick around, which is why we really can't control them. So even positive emotions, we want to hang on to them, and they're just going to keep on going. But the same is true with the so-called negative emotions like, fear and sadness and anger. They will flow through us as well, providing we allow that and we don't try to run away from them literally by putting our shoes and going out for a run, or we don't try to stuff them with food, that we recognize that it's just an emotion that's showing up, and emotions in and of themselves, they don't cause any damage. Inappropriate expression or the repression of them can cause some damage. But the emotion itself, I think a lot about menstrual cramps as really the perfect metaphor, so that we can have the experience of pain, sometimes really intense pain, if we have menstrual cramps, but we know two things. One, we know it will pass, and two, no damage is being done. Even though it may feel like our uterus is going to drop to the floor, that's not what's going on. And so it's the same with our emotional pain. If we can understand that it will pass and no damage is being done by our experiencing it. It's a wave that will move through us, very much like the waves in the ocean. So we're not taught this. So what happens is we think, and because we're taught this, that we're supposed to control our emotions. In fact, it's flat out that we'll control your feelings. And we can't control our emotions per se any more than we can swim up a mountain. It's really not possible. They have their own movement. And the other thing is that, again, we're not taught, is that our emotions, they're part of our guidance system, part of our inner guidance system, along with our instincts and our intuition. And there's value in experiencing the emotions, even those that are very uncomfortable or painful, because they come bearing gifts. And the yuckiest feelings usually have the best gifts. So that if you can be still, allow the feeling to flow through you, then you can receive the gifts. So, for example, the gift of anger is that if we can allow ourselves to really feel it, like this is not okay with me, and this is why it's not okay, and this is how I want for things to be different. If we can allow ourselves the full force of our anger, then what we receive is clarity and maybe fortitude, and maybe even a kind of strength can come with that emotion. Our fear, if we can allow ourselves to fear the fear, paradoxically, the gift we receive is courage. And our loneliness, if we can feel our loneliness rather than trying to shove it out the door when it comes knocking, or, hiding under the bed if it comes in, but to greet our loneliness and say, oh, what brings you here? Because if we can do that, we can receive the gift of self-awareness. the understanding of why we might be keeping others at arm's length and how that experience is leading us to feel cut off, isolated, and lonely. That's valuable information.
Absolutely.
And even something like envy or jealousy, we don't like to feel that, but if you can be with that feeling, you can become aware of what your greatest heart's desire is, and maybe you never even were aware of it until you saw somebody else experiencing that. And so that can put you on the path of, okay, what do I need to do to structure my life, or what do I need to do differently so that that can be my experience as well. Mm-hmm. So these are the gifts that they can bring to us if we aren't so afraid of them, or if we don't see them as the enemy that's just going to bring trouble.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm kind of just sitting here as you're talking, and of course, everything you're saying is profound and so insightful, and my mind's just trying to keep up with it. And I'm just thinking of my clients who, first of all, I'll just check in with you about this. There's no way to recover from an eating disorder without feeling your feelings, right? Like, I've told people this, but maybe if it comes from you, it'll mean something different.
Well, and that's because, we know that the eating disorder is not just about food and eating. And it's about what's behind all of that. Where's the energy that's driving the disordered eating thoughts and behaviors? And oftentimes that energy is emotional energy. And it's hard to put a finger on it because it's an energy. So often what we do is we look for something physical or concrete, and we go, oh, there it is. That's the number on the scale. Or, oh, there it is. It's in my thighs, or it's in the food that's in front of me, because we are emotionally illiterate as a culture. Right. So that's the why, I think, behind why emotional literacy and having a relationship with your feelings is such a integral part of the recovery process.
I wanted to talk more about a couple of emotions in particular, ones that I feel like, as a psychologist, I've seen my clients most pathologize, I guess. And those two, especially for women, are anger, which you've spoken a little bit about, but and also jealousy. I feel like people just do not want to feel those emotions, and usually feel an incredible amount of guilt about those two emotions.
Well, I think there is a reason for that. They're very uncomfortable. And what makes them particularly uncomfortable as emotions is that they create a great deal of separation. So that when you're feeling angry, when you're feeling jealous, you're feeling separate from everybody else and everything else. And that's a horrible feeling. So it's like, ooh, we don't want to go there, but we don't understand that as those feelings move through us, and that's part of the fear, is like, oh my gosh, if I let myself feel this feeling, I'm going to feel it forever. It's never going to go away.
What if I become an angry person if I feel anger this one time?
Yes. Well, and you see, it's not our fault because it's in our language. We say things like, I am angry, where I am jealous. Well, the truth is that isn't who you are. It may be something you're experiencing in this moment, but it does not define who you are. Who you are is way, way more than that. And that is something you're experiencing. It is an energy that's moving through you, but it's not who you are. And so that's one of the reasons why we don't want to feel those feelings, because we misunderstand. We don't understand that they're temporary. They're a temporary experience, and they don't define us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if we can commit to moving through that temporary discomfort of them, which sometimes is incredibly uncomfortable.
Incredibly intense, yeah. Well, the other thing is we don't know what to do with those feelings when they come up, right? It's like we think, oh, I got to do something, and not knowing what to do. And for many individuals, for example, anger is the same as violence. So that has to get teased apart, to understand that, no, they're not the same thing. One is an action. The other is an energy that brings some awareness to us. First of all, when, for example, a boundary is being crossed, whether it's an emotional boundary or a spiritual boundary or a physical boundary where others are just acting as though our space is someplace for them to walk without being invited, we will feel angry. Mm-hmm. That's the emotion that signals us that a boundary is being violated. When somebody tells you how you should be feeling, right, they're in your emotional space and they're crossing a boundary. And it gets really confusing, and we can often get angry about that. It's like, don't tell me how to feel. Mm-hmm. Don't tell me how to feel. And so that's important information to be aware that you don't like it when someone tells you how you're supposed to be feeling. Mm-hmm. Even if that somebody is yourself.
Right. That's a real frustrating one. I've never been there. So tell us a little bit about why we can't control our feelings, or I guess what happens when we try to, and that's our default.
Well, we can't control our feelings because their nature is to flow. And so you're going against their very nature. There are things that you can have a little more control over, but it takes a certain amount of practice and discipline. You can eventually control your attitudes and you can shift your thoughts. But by the time emotions are rolling, they're rolling. So I think that what that means is that you can be in acceptance of them even if you don't like them. The way that we can get into trouble is when we use food, for example, to distract us from our emotions. That interferes with us using them as part of our guidance system. Because then, you know how it is when someone says, I'm not angry. You're just going,
sure.
Oh, okay. They're trying to control it, and it's already, it's on its way. So I think that brings us to what I believe is the second important skill, and frankly, the most important, because I've never, ever, 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 ever seen anyone fully recover, and I've seen hundreds and actually thousands of people fully recover from whatever their eating difficulty is, whether it's, just yo-yo dieting or full-blown eating disorder or whatever. To fully be free, the skill set one needs to develop is the capacity to communicate assertively. And because that involves a certain amount of emotional literacy as well. So that kind of takes it all into play. And assertive communication is when you can identify, accept, and express your feelings in the kindest way possible. And again, we're not taught this. If I had it my way, this would be taught in every school in the country. I mean, how often do I need my algebra, right?
Right.
But assertive communication, daily.
I know, every day, right?
It's critical, especially if you're in an intimate relationship, especially if you're in a relationship with someone that you're close to. This skill is absolutely essential, but we need it in our work life with our bosses and with our colleagues, and we need it in a lot of situations. But it's so critical because if you are not able to identify, accept, and express your emotions, then the chances of turning to eating behaviors is amplified. And so it's really an important skill.
So tell us a little bit about, because I can just imagine, like myself in this position years ago, if I were listening to this episode of the podcast, my former self, I would hear you say that and I would have been like, what do you mean I have to be assertive one day? So talk a little bit about why you think assertiveness can be so hard for people who have eating disorders.
Well, it's hard for everybody.
That's true.
When I didn't learn to be assertive until I was in graduate school, it was hard. It's a skill that takes practice, but well worth it. So it's hard for everybody because typically we're not taught it. Many of us may have been that way as young children and it got shushed out of us for one reason or another. And so then it's a matter of relearning it. But let me explain really what I'm talking about so that your listeners can get a sense of that. So typically most of us are taught only two forms of communication. One is a passive way of communicating where we say yes to things when we want to say no. We act like things are okay when they're not. And what happens with that as being our primary mode of communication is it really affects our self-esteem. because we act as though our needs and feelings and thoughts don't count, and we teach other people to act as though our needs and feelings don't count. And so after all, we start to believe our thoughts and feelings and needs don't count. It's a vicious cycle. So it really messes with your self-esteem.
Of course.
And so then the other way, other primary form of communication that we're taught is an aggressive form of communication. So with a passive way, we say yes and oh, it's no big deal, or that's okay.
I'm fine.
We act as our needs don't count. In an aggressive form of communication, we act like our needs and feelings count, but we don't care whose toes get stepped on, whose feelings get hurt in the process. So aggressive way of communicating, you may speak up, unlike the passive way, but you do it in a way that involves name calling, put downs of the other person. So there's not a respect for the other person's needs and feelings. And fortunately, then the third way, which is assertiveness, is where you're able to act as though your needs and feelings count and act as though the other person's needs and feelings count. This is really valuable when there's conflict, and the closer you are to another individual, the more opportunity there's going to be for conflict, because we usually don't choose to hang out with clones. So that's where this skill set is so important. So I'll give you a real life situation of what would this look like. Let's say, Janine, that you borrowed a book from me, and I said, hey, you're welcome to use that book, but in a couple of weeks I'm giving a talk and I need that book. I need to review that book as a resource. So if you can return it to me by next week, that would be great. And you say, okay, fine. And so then what happens is you forget to return the book. And I go ahead and I give my talk, and it was a little difficult. I really needed that book as a resource. A week later, I run into you in the grocery store, and as soon as you see me, you go, oh my gosh, Anita, I forgot about the book. Now, I were to respond in a passive way, I would say, oh, that's okay. It's no big deal, which isn't the truth. But you don't know that it's not the truth. So what that means is the next time you borrow something, you're going to assume I don't really mean it when I tell you when I need it back. And so it'll happen again and again. And after a while, I'll start getting so annoyed with you that I'm going to give you the cold shoulder. And you're going to feel that, but you're not going to have any idea how. And eventually, when you finally do something that's not okay with me, I'm going to go, that's it. I don't even want anything to do with her anymore. And I will end the relationship. So ultimately, down the road, that's what happens to relationships with passive communication. So let's take the exact same scenario, and this time I'm going to respond in an aggressive way. So you borrow the book, forget to return it on time. I run into you in the grocery store. You see me, and you go, oh, my gosh, I forgot about the book. And I say, I can't believe you did that. Didn't I tell you I needed that book for my talk last week? Thanks a lot. How can you be so inconsiderate?
Oh, man.
Okay. Now, I'm getting my needs met, which was to let you know that wasn't okay, that you didn't return it. But I'm doing it in a way that's name calling. I'm calling you inconsiderate. I'm putting you down. You can hear that in the tone of my voice. I'm being very accusatory. And now, how is that going to affect our relationship?
Probably isn't going to make me want to hang out with you. Definitely not borrow books anymore.
You got it. You will create the distance.
But that's an excellent point that you're bringing up, though, that assertive communication is really considerate of the other person's feelings as well, because I think it gets presented a lot of time as that we need to do what we need to do for ourselves, which is true, but you can't disregard the effect of that.
Yes, you have to treat your feelings as though they are equally as important, not more and not less. So let's take the exact same scenario, and this time I'm going to respond in an assertive way. So you borrow the book, forget to return it, run into you in the grocery store, and you see me and go, oh my gosh, I forgot about the book. And I say, oh yeah, Jeannie, I really could have used that book. The next time you borrow something, please return it when I say I need it. Now, you might feel like, you might feel a little funny, but the difference is that I'm not calling you names. I'm not putting you down. I'm just letting you know how your behavior affected my feelings for your information. And not only that, but you're not going to have to be going, ooh, Anita's in some kind of weird mood. I don't understand what's going on. You're going to know this about me, that I'll just put it on the table. And not only that, I'm assuming our relationship is going to continue. The next time you borrow something, please return it on time. I'm letting you know something about me, that when I say things like that, I really mean it. Somebody else may not mean it, but I mean it. So you can see how the more you become assertive, what happens is it helps create intimacy. because you and I can get closer because we don't have to worry about what's going on with the other person.
Right.
We'll know, and it may not feel good what I said, but I'm not intentionally trying to get you to feel bad.
Well, and to me, that's a good example of the difference between guilt and shame. You're not shaming me, telling me I'm a terrible person for that in the assertive example, but I probably would feel some guilt because I messed up a little bit. It's not the biggest mistake in the world, but it's like, oops, probably shouldn't have done that. I wish I would have taken more care to remind myself of that. And then you carry on.
And then you carry on.
Yep.
But you see, look what happens with the other two ways. There's no carrying on. There's either with a passive, a way of communicating, resentment builds like nobody's business. And with the aggressive way, afterwards, if you are really aggressive with someone, you feel really bad because then there's the pendulum swing. And that's when you are passive till you can't keep your mouth shut any longer. You swing over, become aggressive, let it all out, blast someone, and then you go, whoops, and you go back to being passive till you can't stand any longer and swing over. And then you start to feel really out of control. And this is what people are talking about when they say, I can't control my emotions. It's really, the lack of assertive communication that's jamming things up, not the emotions themselves.
And I think our eating disorders love it when we have these unhelpful communication patterns, and they really do a lot to block any kind of intimacy.
Well, it's because, and here's it, once you learn how to be assertive, you see, you don't have to block intimacy because you can take care of yourself just fine and take care of the relationship if someone in the relationship does something that's not okay with you. And I can guarantee that will happen. If you're in a relationship of any sort, the time will come eventually that person is going to do something that's not okay with you. And they may be oblivious to that, or they may not know how strongly you feel about it. It's going to happen. So this way, you don't have to avoid relationships and then have your primary relationship be with your eating disorder. You can have nourishing, fulfilling relationships, knowing full well that you can take care of yourself in the event a conflict arises.
Right. So why did you pick assertive communication as the number one skill that's essential for recovery?
I think it just came out of observation. I started noticing that when individuals that I worked with, when they developed this skill, and they didn't develop it perfectly, none of us do.
Yeah, who does?
Right. That cleared their eating disorder because they found their voice. A lot of times we're afraid to express ourselves because we don't want to be mean. We don't want to be jerks, but we don't know quite how to do that. How do you say something to someone that they may not want to hear, in a way that maybe they can receive it, but even if they can't receive it, we know that we've done it in a respectful manner. You see, if you have confidence in your ability to do that, then you can trust your voice. Then you don't have to use the eating disorder to communicate all kinds of stuff for you. Or create, the walls for you to hide behind so you don't have to communicate.
Mm-hmm. So I guess taking a step back, I would love to talk about how can we cultivate more emotional literacy and practice assertive communication more?
Well, they go together. There's a particular formula. Again, understanding that this is a skill. It's like driving a car or riding a bike or, in the beginning, it can seem a little overwhelming or maybe a lot overwhelming, but with practice, you can get the hang of it. So there's a formula that I have people begin with. And yes, it's rather contrived, but it's like when you're learning a new language, you have to start with just the basics. And so the formula goes something like this. When you, and then you describe the behavior. When you leave your towel on the floor, when you say you're going to call at 7 and you don't call until 9. These are just the facts. You don't want to say when you put me down like that because we've left the facts already. We're already into your interpretation. So the first part of the formula is to describe the behavior that is stirring up a feeling in you. And then, so the second part of the formula is I feel. Now you name the feeling. I feel annoyed. I feel concerned. I feel sad. I feel excited. I feel upset. You name a feeling. Usually you pick just one. We want to spew out a whole bunch of feelings, and typically you want to just pick one, and this is where the emotional literacy comes in. You need to have a quite a repertoire that you develop of different feelings. There's two that go together, and that is hurt and angry. And so that's typically the exception I make, because sometimes those just go together. Mm-hmm. But other than that, you pick emotion. When you leave your towel on the floor, I feel annoyed, and it can be past tense. Yesterday, when you left your towel on the floor, I felt annoyed, okay? So that's the good thing about the formula. You don't have to be able to use it in the moment and be on target. The third part of the formula, that's the hard part, because now you have to do a little soul searching. You have to go, okay, what is it about them leaving the towel on the floor that stirs up annoyance in me? Now, again, our language trips us up because we like to say, you make me annoyed or you make me angry. And that's how we're taught to talk. But the truth is nobody makes you feel that way. They do behaviors that stir up feelings in you because of the meaning you give to that behavior. So you have to own it. It's yours. So the third part is to answer the question, well, how come that behavior stirs up this feeling in me? And so typically it might be something like, because it gives me the impression, because it seems to me, or because I get the idea. So when you leave your towel on the floor, I feel annoyed because it gives me the impression you expect me to pick up after you. When you say you're going to call at 7 and then don't call until 9, I feel angry because I get the idea that you don't value my schedule. Do you see what I'm saying? One sentence takes you right to the heart of the matter where you're owning it. You're not blaming the other person for your feelings, but you are letting them know this is how this behavior affects your feelings for their information. Now, here's what's important. A lot of people think they'll come back. I'll have clients that say, well, I tried being assertive. It didn't work. What do you mean it didn't work? He kept leaving his towel on the floor. Well, if your intention in using the assertive formula or communicating assertively is to get the other person to change their behavior, to change their attitude, to change their whatever, the odds aren't so great. And that is not the goal of assertive communication. The goal of assertive communication is to change your behavior so that you're responding differently to the feelings that come up, so they can come up and flow right out of you, so that you can communicate your truth in the kindest way possible, so you don't have to stuff them with food or run from them with compulsive exercising or whatever it is that you might do. That is the goal of assertive communication. So basically, you are simply informing the other person this is how their behavior affects your feelings for their information. And if you forget, no worries, because I'll be sure to remind you the next time you do it. And then, if you have to do it over and over, who cares? This way, you don't even have to come up with a brand new assertive sentence. You just repeat yourself.
Right. Yep. And sometimes, and we're all in this position ourselves, but sometimes the people in our lives need a little bit of coaching, especially when we're trying to do things differently that are really important. Like if you are in a family and the family is used to always talking about food and commenting on food, and that's the whole conversation every time you have dinner, and as part of your recovery, you're trying to change that in your family dynamic, you're not going to tell them, when we all talk about food at dinner, it makes me feel anxious because blah, 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 and then everything's going to change after one intervention. That's probably going to be a whole process, a lot of practice, a lot of repeating.
Right. But there's other parts to being assertive, because there are 2 other techniques besides the formula. Because sometimes when you assert yourself, other people might respond aggressively. So that's also part of being assertive. There's a little bit more to it, because it's a way of establishing boundaries, because typically people with struggles, with eating difficulties, they have a tendency to absorb other people's nonsense. And the assertive formula is a way to keep from doing that. So, for example, if I say, when you leave your towel on the floor, I feel annoyed because it seems to me you expect me to pick up after you. And the other person says, well, what about the dish you left in the sink? And you leave stuff all over the place, right? So that can be a response you get. And with the assertive communication, what happens is you learn, it's sort of like verbal martial arts. Because what happens when someone responds aggressively, they're trying to get you to talk about something else. And that's why you end up in this discussion. You're going, wait, how do we end up over here? We're talking about this. So, when someone is aggressive in their communication, there's what I call deflection, which is another technique. And you just say, Well, that may be so, but I want you to know yesterday when you left your towel on the floor, this is how I felt.
Mm-hmm.
And they may come back at you. Typically, it takes 3 times. But if you simply deflect and say, well, you may be right. You're not saying they're right. You're not saying they're wrong. You may be right, but it's important to me that you understand that this is how I feel when you leave your towel on the floor. And after the 3rd time, that usually takes the energy out of it, and you haven't lost your balance, and you haven't absorbed the nonsense. You've just stayed clear about this is how you feel, and this is how come, and that's that.
I love it. And I love that it's a skill, because a skill, what I always tell people, it means if something is a skill, it can be learned.
Anyone can learn it.
Anyone can learn it. Yep. Mm-hmm. I have a question as we're talking about emotions and emotional literacy and how to develop some more assertiveness. And you said something really interesting, which is that people who have eating disorders are pretty prone to absorbing other people's nonsense. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if you would talk a little bit about what does it mean to be sensitive?
Yeah. So this is what I've come to observe over time is that typically those who struggle with disordered eating, they are emotionally sensitive and highly intuitive. And I think of that as being thin-skinned in the sense that if they don't have the skill set that one needs in order to maneuver as a thin-skinned person in this world, and when I say this world, I mean this world that, number one, doesn't even recognize it, number two, doesn't value it. In fact, we're taught, it's like, get over it, or you're too sensitive, or, hey, you should just handle that like water off a duck's back, or
get
what's
thicker
wrong
skin.
With you? Yeah, exactly. That's the message we get. And so if you don't know how to maneuver, we don't have a culture that's even going to teach us about that. Assertiveness is important because that is a skill for maneuvering as a thin-skinned person in a thick-skinned world. And I believe you're born this way. You're not going to change it any more than you can change the color of your eyes. And frankly, I don't even think there's anything wrong with it. I think there's something really lovely about being emotionally sensitive, because what can come with that is compassion and empathy, which is something that's really needed in this world. This ability to imagine what it might be like to be in somebody else's shoes. However, you also need to learn how to protect yourself so you're not a sponge, so that if you walk into the room and you feel a tense vibe, it doesn't penetrate your very bones, for example. And so what I discovered is that a lot of people who struggle with eating disorders, they were using the eating disorder as a tool in a way to try to keep themselves from feeling the intensity of everything that they were picking up, either intuitively or emotionally.
Right. And I mean, I would say from my own experience, I still am a very sensitive person, a highly sensitive person, which is a great book, by the way. And I always feel things really deeply, and I feel the most like myself when I'm all tapped into that compassion streak that I have. But I also have gotten so much more assertive in my life, and definitely have the ability to let things go too. So even if I felt it deeply when it started, I don't stay in it as long if I don't really need to. So there's hope.
Yeah. Well, because it's an emotion, and it can keep on moving unless you try to block it in some way.
Yeah, they go away if you don't fight and grip them to death. I was hoping that in kind of moving toward the end of our interview here, you would tell us one of the stories, and we could talk a little bit more about signs that people are making progress in recovery. And I was hoping you would talk to us about the labyrinth. Oh,
okay. Well, I use the concept of a labyrinth as a metaphor for what the recovery journey looks like. And I'm shifting a little away even from the word recovery, because I think I like the word transformation even more, because it's this idea that we're transforming from one way of being into another. And with a labyrinth, the reason I picked that is that I noticed initially that my clients were imagining this recovery journey, this transformation journey, as more like a maze. Now, a maze is different from a labyrinth in that with a maze, there are dead ends. You'll come up against something, you go, oh, shoot, went the wrong way, I got to turn around, go back. It's there are mistakes to be made. There are wrong turns. You can get lost in it like you can with a labyrinth, but it's very different in that there are actual blocks. A labyrinth is an ancient meditative tool that looks like a maze, except there are no dead ends, there are no blocks, but you do find a twisting, turning, winding path that goes into the very center of the labyrinth, and then following that same path, it takes you out of the labyrinth. It can, though, be very disorienting and very confusing and very frustrating, just like you would find in a maze, just like you would find in the recovery journey. But the idea with the labyrinth that I really like is that all you have to do, if you're getting overwhelmed or frustrated or confused, is slow it down. All you have to do is put one foot in front of the other. And it's not a matter of going through one side and then out the other. You're going into the center of your being. And that's why it's been an important metaphor in many spiritual traditions that take you into the heart of the matter, that take you into the center of your essence. And what I've discovered with clients on the recovery journey is that on the way in, that's where they're learning stuff about themselves, learning about who they are at their essential core. And then when they make their way out, that's when they apply the skills that they've learned to express the essence of who they are out in the world that they live in. And so for me, it's not linear. It's not even very goal-oriented, which is, with a maze, it's like, okay, I'm in and I'm out. Mm-hmm. The labyrinth evokes something very different, which is why there are even famous labyrinths on the floor of the Chartres Cathedral, for example, that for hundreds of years, people have, as a part of a meditation, a spiritual meditation, have walked these labyrinths because it's a very different feeling of the journey. And so when I recognized what it really looked like to be in recovery, because it's sort of like when you're weaving around and with a labyrinth, you feel like, oh wait, I was just here, but you were here in a different way. Just like someone would say, wait, I already dealt with my mother issues. How come we're talking about that again? It's like, well, yeah, you dealt with it at this level of understanding, but now you're here and you can look at it in a different way, even though it might seem the same. Your vantage point is different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and I can totally relate to personally and working as a professional with how a lot of the times the same sort of issues come up, and that's because they need to come up all those different times and be looked at in different ways because we become different people. So I often use your labyrinth metaphor to be able to talk with the people I work with about how recovery is not linear. And I know that they hate that. I mean, I actually kind of hate that too. Like, I like everything in order at right angles and clean cut, and that's not how it goes. Why, Dr. Johnston, why can't it just be linear?
Well, actually, because life is not linear. Life is cyclical. And if you look in nature, it's going to be very unusual if you can see right angles that are perfectly straight, right? We humans, we create things in that way with our buildings and our doorways, but nature itself is not that way.
I'm just thinking about how many hearts we're going to break with this episode. Things aren't linear. We have to feel our feelings, and we've got to be assertive. In kind of wrapping up for today, what have you observed over all of your years of work and contribution to the field as some signs that people are transforming and recovering?
Well, I know hundreds, and I've heard over these, I've been in this field a long time. I've heard from thousands of people who have totally, completely recovered. And for me, this is very exciting. This is why I do the work I do, because I really do believe that the people who experience and recover from eating disorders are the people the world has been waiting for. Because you have these individuals that have this thin-skinned nature and they learn to work with it, which is exactly what our world needs today. It needs a level of understanding and sensitivity and compassion so that there can be more connection, there can be more fulfillment. So I've been around long enough to know these two things, that full, complete recovery is absolutely possible. And two, it's not going back to the life you had before you had an eating disorder. It's living a life beyond your wildest dreams, beyond what you, with your little mind that you have, that we all have, more than that you could imagine. And yes, it is difficult at times. I'm not denying that. But the joy that's around that corner is extraordinary. It's amazing. And so I think, it's important to understand that this is a journey well worth taking. I'm sure you'd agree with me on that.
Oh, absolutely. I do have a life outside of my work with eating disorders, but it's a huge chunk of my life, and it's a huge chunk of the person I've become and of where I've been. And I can't even express how amazing things are and how deeply, truly grateful I am for my life. Like, there is no way. I think maybe I've even said this to you on the podcast. If not, I've probably said it in just actual life. But if you would have gone back and told my little eating disordered self at the very beginning of recovery, when I was just reading your book for the first time, oh, did you know that one day you're not only going to be recovered, but you're going to help people do this, and then you're going to write books about it and have this podcast? I probably either would have told you to shut your mouth, or I would have passed out. There's no way. So, and it's not just all the clients I've worked with too. I've never heard somebody say, yeah, I went through that recovery process and it was like, meh, it was so-so. Everybody I know who's fully recovered, or even who has a significant chunk of recovery under their belt and they're really getting solid in it, they've all been truly transformed. I love the use of that word, actually. Let's make the field change it.
Well, I think it is transformative, and you step into, it really is a world beyond your wildest dreams. And that's what makes the whole process, for me, very exciting and also worthwhile and inspiring.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Johnston, as always, it was amazing to have you on the podcast. I hope you'll come back and treat us again to another episode. It's always wonderful having you here. You're so insightful and so kind and gracious and so clear, even though you're so profound. So I know everybody loves your episodes. I get emails about them all the time. So thank you for joining us and taking the time to do that.
You are so welcome. It's my pleasure, and I'm happy to be here.
Thanks for joining me for another episode. Let's keep in touch. You can find all the information you need about the podcast at eatingdisorderrecoverypodcast.com, including full podcast episodes and links to all of our social media sites. You can join our Facebook group for the podcast by searching Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast on Facebook. This is a closed group for listeners of the podcast looking to connect, share resources, and get involved in a pro-recovery community. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or YouTube. Please leave us a review and let us know how we're doing. Talk to you next time on the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast.